Now, you all know that because of my archaeology background, I want to give you some insights into what was taking place at the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. And we can gain some of it from the Word of God, and others I will fill in behind the scenes. And that's the blessing that we get to go behind the scenes here at Real Life Church and find out some things that are not specifically recorded in the Bible and yet are hinted at or implied. We're going to begin in John chapter 18 tonight and verse 12. Because what happened is, you know, we left off Tuesday evening. It was the Last Supper. And you all know, I'm not going to actually be studying that with you tonight, but Jesus went out and he went to the Mount of Olives. Let me just set one scene on the Mount of Olives. Jerusalem is on a hill, the Mount of Olives on a separate hill. Kidron Valley between the two. Jesus is somewhere on the side of the Mount of Olives here, praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's dark. It's nighttime. Remember, we ended the service and it was night. So it's dark. When the chief priests and the captain of the guard came out of the gates of Jerusalem to go to the Mount of Olives, there were no streetlights. They would have had torches. Jesus, as he's praying in agony, would have seen the torches coming down from Jerusalem, from the city, to the Kidron Valley. He would have seen them and known they are coming for him as he's praying. And then see them at the bottom of the Kidron Valley and begin up. Every moment he knows is his last. And it's getting shorter and shorter. And as he's praying with agony, knowing they're about to arrest him. Now they arrest him at night, so there's nobody around. They didn't want to do it in the daylight because there might be a riot. They arrest him at night because he's by himself with a few of his apostles. They arrest him at night so no one knows and no one sees. It's all in secret. Now verse 12. Then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him. So they don't just arrest him, they put shackles on him, manacles, restraints. They tie him up as if he's going to escape, as if he's a criminal, as if he's dangerous. They tied him up and led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now, Annas. Let's talk about Annas for a moment. Annas was the high priest from the year 6 to the year 15 A.D. He was deposed by the Romans for one reason or another. The Romans deposed him, took him away from being high priest, but he was still the power broker. His 5 sons, in turn, each became high priest, and Caiaphas is his son-in-law. So it's obvious that Caiaphas doesn't hold the real power because they didn't take Jesus to Caiaphas first, they took him to Annas first. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Skip to verse 19. The high priest asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. Jesus answered him. Now, he's being questioned. He's being interrogated. It's nighttime, and he's being interrogated. And he's not in front of the Sanhedrin. He is here at at Annas' house, and probably some of the leading members of the Sanhedrin are there. They're questioning him. They want to get a judgment against him before they present him to the entire Sanhedrin. So it's kind of like if you think about our Congress, when they have things that go to committee first, and the committee debates it and votes on it, and if it passes committee, then it goes to the full Congress for a vote. That's what this is. This is like a committee. And they want to get a consensus that he's guilty before they present him to the whole Sanhedrin. Jesus answers, I spoke openly to the world. I taught in the synagogue and in the temple, where all of the Jewish people were. Nothing in secret have I said. Why do you ask me of them which heard me? And I said to them, behold, you know what I said. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by slapped Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, is this how you answer the high priest? Now, you might say, wait a second, this is Annas. Annas is still called the high priest, just like today. Mike Huckabee is the ambassador to Israel, but he's also called Governor Huckabee because he was formerly a governor. So you still call him that honorary governor because he was. And so Annas is still called the high priest, even though he's not the acting high priest at the moment. And Jesus answered, if I've spoken evil, bear witness of that evil. But if well, why are you hitting me? Now Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. All right, now we're going to pick up, keep your finger here because we're coming back here. We're going to go to Matthew chapter 26. Now, about now, it's midnight. So it's about midnight in Israel. Now, what do you think people do at midnight in Israel? They sleep. They're behind locked doors. They're at home. Nobody's out. And this is the Passover. Nobody is going to be out. It's a holiday. Everybody's home with family. Jesus is sent about midnight to Caiaphas. Now I want to look at verse 57. Chapter 26, verse 57. They that had laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and elders were assembled. So Caiaphas, the high priest, the scribes and the elders are assembled there. Peter follows afar off to the high priest's palace and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now, did anybody catch anything that I just read? Palace. It said palace. The Bible does not say things it doesn't mean. The high priest, Caiaphas, lived in a palace. Now, let's just talk for a moment about the palaces in Jerusalem. Herod the Great, who was king when Jesus was born, built a phenomenal palace in Jerusalem on the west side. Herod, his descendant, Antipas, should be in that palace, but he's not. That palace has been taken over by Rome because Rome adjudicated Herod the Great's will when he died and confiscated his palace. So, following Herod the Great, Archelaus, one of his sons, ruled in Jerusalem, but was so awful that Rome moved in, deposed him, exiled him, and that's when they began Roman governorship, direct rule of Israel, because Archelaus was so bad. So the governor lived in Herod's palace on the west side of the city. Those of you who've been to Jerusalem or been with us in Jerusalem, the west side of the city is where the Jaffa Gate is, where the citadel of David is. That's the west side of the city. So that's one palace. Now, at the time of the independence of Israel prior to Jesus, remember Judas Maccabeus, the Maccabee revolt, the Hasmoneans, Hanukkah coming about. Okay, during that time, the family of the Hasmoneans also built a palace because they ruled. They were the high priestly family ruling Israel at the time. They built a palace. It was about halfway between Herod's palace and the Temple Mount, about halfway. That palace was no longer lived in by the Hasmoneans or the Hasmonean family or the high priests. That palace was lived in by the descendants of Herod. They confiscated it. So Herod's palace confiscated by the Romans, the Hasmonean palace confiscated by Herod. So that's where Herod is. Now the high priest wants his own palace. Must have had enough money somehow to build a palace. Again, those of you who've been with us to Israel, you remember the Herodian mansion. If you've been with us, we go underground because the excavation, of course, was not done up above ground the way normally you go from the top down because there's a city up there. So rather than tear down the modern city to dig in, they went underground and excavated. And so there's a palace, and it's called the Herodian mansion is how they call it. They don't call it palace, the Herodian mansion. It is huge, huge, and it has all the finest elements in it, including alabaster tables, alabaster vessels, which were used by the priests because they could not become unclean, unkosher. Anyway, That is an example. It spreads out and spreads out. It's a huge building. So this building was big enough to be called a palace, as well as to hold the Sanhedrin meeting there, because it says in the verse before, they all came to meet there. Now, if we go back to John, we go through Peter denying Jesus. I'm not going to be talking about that too much tonight. I'm going to talk about the fact that he's questioned and they cannot find witnesses. They need 2 witnesses. Now, in order for the Sanhedrin to be there, they all had to have messengers go to the houses and pull them out of the house at midnight. They're there in the middle of the night. Jewish law says that if it's a question of life and death, which is what this trial is, it must be conducted in the daylight. So from the very start, this is an illegal trial. They are to be doing this in the daylight. They're doing it at midnight. Secondly, the Jewish people no longer have the right of capital punishment. When the Romans come into a country and take it over, they take away the local right of capital punishment. Only the Romans have the right of capital punishment. When they were going to stone that woman caught in adultery, that was against Roman law. When Stephen was stoned, that was against Roman law. And so they could not put Jesus to death, even though they were judging him. And what did they actually judge Jesus to be guilty of? Blasphemy. Blasphemy. Why? Because they said, "Are you the Messiah?" You see, they couldn't get witnesses to agree. They needed 2 witnesses to agree. This is also evidence how rapidly they put this trial together. They didn't get their witnesses ahead of time. They didn't get their stories straight. You'd think they would have gotten them and say, okay, you got to say this and you got to say this. Get it together here. They didn't have time to do that. So they couldn't find 2 witnesses to agree. So finally, in exasperation, Caiaphas says, "Are you the Messiah or not?" And Jesus answers, "You say that I am. And after this, you are going to see me coming in the clouds of glory." And they shout, "Blasphemy!" Caiaphas rips his clothing. However, it's not blasphemy. According to Jewish law, for it to be blasphemy, the unmentionable name of God must be said, must be spoken. Jesus never said the name of God. So they're shouting blasphemy to stir each other up, but that never actually took place. So even the charge that they're going to charge him with is a made-up charge. It's not real. Everything here is illegal in this trial. So what's the next step? They got to bring him to Pilate because they can't put him to death. So verse 28, we're back in John 18. They led Jesus from Caiaphas to the hall of judgment. It was early, so all night long, Jesus is in their hands. The trial probably took an hour, 2 hours, and now it's early in the morning. They themselves did not go into the judgment hall lest they should be defiled. Now, I find this really ironic. They're breaking their own law in trying him at night, accusing him of blasphemy, which he didn't do, delivering him to the Gentiles. He's a Jew, and yet they are so concerned that they're going to become defiled by going into the judgment hall. How hypocritical. How ironic. Because they wanted to eat the Passover. You might say, didn't they already eat the Passover? There are 2 nights for the Passover. There's the first night and the second night of Passover. Pilate went out to them. Now, what Pilate does, he must have been tipped off that there's going to be a big trial coming because he had his judgment seat moved out into the courtyard so that the Jewish people didn't have to come under his roof. So the seat was already set up in the courtyard. "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If he were not a lawbreaker, we wouldn't have delivered him." Now, what answer is that? What is that? They can't answer because Pilate is not concerned with blasphemy. He's concerned with Roman law. And Roman law has nothing to do with religious law. They were delivering him for religious law. He does not adjudicate religious law. So that's why when he asked, what does he do? What did he do? They couldn't tell him. Because he would say, well, I don't deal with that. They answered and said, if he were not a malefactor, if he were not a lawbreaker, we wouldn't have delivered him. Then said Pilate to them, Take him and judge him according to your law. He knows already what the deal is. He knows they're jealous, they're envious. He knows Jesus stirred things up. He knows Jesus has been on their case for being hypocrites. The Jews therefore said to him, it's not lawful for us to put him to death. He's already been condemned to death in their eyes. There's no trial coming up with Pilate. They're saying, Pilate, we're giving him to you to put to death. That's period. That's all we need you to do. Just kill him. That the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he said, signifying what death. Pilate entered again to the judgment hall. He called Jesus and said, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus said, are you saying this by yourself or did somebody else tell you? Pilate answered and said, am I a Jew? Your own nation and chief priests, they've delivered you. What have you done? Jesus says, my kingdom's not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place. Pilate therefore said to him, are you a king then? Jesus said, you say that I'm a king. To this end was I born. For this reason I came into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate said, what is truth? Pilate, in those three words, what is truth? He says the hypocrisy of everyone involved. What is true? Is this religion of the high priest true? That they're holy and that they present offerings of sacrifice and blood in the temple and yet deliver an innocent man into my hands for me to kill? Is that true? What is truth? We say the same thing when we look at religion today. What is truth? We look at profligate churches. Churches that should be leading people into a relationship with God and do not. What is true? When he had said this, he went out again to the Jews. He said to them, I find in him no fault. Now notice here, what is he basically doing? He is saying, I've made my judgment. He's not guilty. I find no fault. He's declaring him not guilty. But you have a custom that I should release unto you one at the Passover. Will you therefore I release unto you the king of the Jews? They cried, saying, no, Barabbas. Barabbas was a robber. Now Barabbas, anybody remember the Anthony Quinn playing Barabbas in the movie, the old movie? Barabbas is an interesting character. So Barabbas, as you know, gets released. Barabbas is a murderer, a robber, guilty. Barabbas is guilty. And yet Pilate is forced to release a guilty man and condemn Jesus, who's not guilty. Barabbas is you and I. We are Barabbas. We are the ones that have been released. We are guilty, but we've been released. And Jesus punished. So whenever you see Barabbas, it's like looking into a mirror. The story and the Spirit of God has this turn of events, and it's recorded for us that we would see ourselves. That just as this guilty man is released, we've been released because of Jesus. Now in Luke, I'm going to go to Luke just briefly, because about this time in Luke, chapter 23, I'm going to start in verse 1. The whole multitude arose and led him to Pilate. They accused him. We found this fellow perverting the nation, forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying he's Christ the king. Pilate said, are you king of the Jews? You say it, Jesus said. Then Pilate to the chief priest said, I find no fault. And the more fiercely stirring up the people, and they make an error. They blunder. At this point, and this isn't recorded in John, but here it is in Luke. At this point, the chief priests blunder. They make a huge mistake which could have cost them their case. They said, he's teaching throughout all of Judaism, beginning from Galilee to this place. They made a mistake. They said Galilee. Because the jurisdiction of Pilate did not extend to Galilee. Galilee was under the jurisdiction of the Herodian family, Herod. Antipas. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked if this man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he was, he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction. So he sent him to Herod. Now, why would he do that? Very complex politics going on here. Herod did not like Pilate. Pilate did not like Herod. Pilate was ruling on behalf of Rome. Herod ruling on behalf of himself. They stepped on each other's toes. Every opportunity Herod had to report on Pilate, he did. So, Pilate put up shields in his palace, which was typical, but they had faces of gods. He was unaware of the prohibition in Judaism, and there was a riot, and many people died. That was reported to Rome. Tiberius made him take those shields down. Strike one. Strike two, Pilate borrowed funds out of the temple treasury to bring a new aqueduct into Jerusalem because there was a water shortage in Jerusalem. Now, you and I know he could not have gotten his hands on those funds without the chief priests helping him, which means the chief priests most likely got a kickback. They were in it together. And the fact that the water was brought in the temple area. So the chief priests have jurisdiction of the temple area. And yet, when it was discovered by the populace that that Pilate had taken money from the treasury, there was a huge riot. About 6,000 were killed. Rome came down hard on Pilate and said, you've got to follow and adhere to the customs of the people of Israel. Strike two. About 2 months before this trial, Pilate again blundered. He put shields up in his palace, but they had no images. But because of the memory of the other images, Herod Antipas wrote a letter behind his back to Rome and accused him of putting shields up again. Didn't mention that there were no faces. Strike three. Pilate was put on notice. One more mistake and you're out of there. You'll be recalled to Rome and face punishment. So Pilate, in a shrewd political move, gives Jesus to Herod to curry favor with Herod, to kind of patch things up with Herod. So Jesus is a pawn in the political game. So what happens before Herod? When Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he wanted to see him for a long time. Now keep in mind, Jesus is a Galilean, Herod is ruler of Galilee, and has never seen him, never spoken to him, never seen one of his miracles, never been in one of his meetings. And he wanted to see for a long time because he wanted to see a miracle. He questioned him, but Jesus answered nothing. Chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Herod with his men of war set him at naught, mocked him, put a gorgeous robe on him, sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Pilate and Herod were made friends, for before there was a division between them. So that small gesture brought these two political factions together. So now he's back to Pilate, and I'm going to go back to John chapter 18. Now it's chapter 19, verse 1. Now Pilate, therefore, took Jesus and scourged him. The soldiers put a crown of thorns on his head. They put on him a purple robe. They said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They smote him with their hands. They slapped him. Pilate, therefore, went forth again. Right now, Jesus has been scourged. The Roman scourging would go down to the bones of the back. You know, your ribs, the back of your ribs. His skin would have been shredded, hanging down, bleeding profusely. Many, many died through scourging. That's how horrible it was. And the crown of thorns on his head, he would have been bleeding from that. The thorns in Israel are not poisonous, but they're long, very sharp, and for some reason, very, very painful. I mean, I have rose bushes, and if I get my finger caught on a rose thorn, it's no big deal. But for some reason, the thorns in Israel are extremely painful, even if they don't go in real deeply. It's as if they were poisonous. They're just very painful. This was in his head. Blood would have been coming down. His back would have been shredded. So Pilate, I believe, is bringing him out to the people to see if this is enough. Has it gone far enough? Will they be satisfied with the torture I've inflicted on this man? To see one of their own tortured at the hands of Gentiles. Will that be enough for them to relent and say, okay, he's punished enough? When the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said, "You take him and crucify him, because I find him not guilty." They said, "We have a law, and by our law he ought to die. He made himself the Son of God." When Pilate therefore heard that, he was afraid. He went again into the judgment hall, and he said to Jesus, "Where do you come from?" Pilate is not easily shaken. Pilate is a career officer, career politician, shrewd politician. He's not easily shaken, but this shook him up. Something about this case shook him up. Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate said to him, "Speak. Don't you know I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you?" Jesus said, "You have no power at all, except it were given from above. Therefore, he that delivered me to you has the greater sin." From that moment on, Pilate wanted to release him, but the people cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you're not Caesar's friend." Now, that doesn't resonate with us too much today. But there was a club, kind of what we compare it to today, a fraternity. Have you ever seen cars that have fraternity things on the back, Delta Phi Pi or something? You know, I was never part of a fraternity. But there are academic fraternities, there are various and sororities, and once you're a fraternity brother, you're a fraternity brother for life. Even when you're not in that school anymore, you're part of that fraternity. Well, there's a fraternity called Friends of Caesar. You got a ring, a special ring from that. And to be a friend of Caesar, when you're in that fraternity, you're in it for life. The only way that you leave that fraternity is when you die, or one other way, and that is being disgraced and the ring being torn off your finger by Caesar himself. For them to say, "You are not Caesar's friend," is a veiled threat that he's had 3 strikes, and they have the power to write a letter to Rome, to Tiberius, and have this fraternity stripped from his resume and have him recalled to Rome. The power is literally in their hands to have Pilate, their governor, recalled. "Whosoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out. That was the tipping point. Sat down in the place that's called Gabbatha, the pavement. It was the preparation for the Passover, about the 6th hour. He said to them, "Behold your king," ecce homo in Latin. They cried, "Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said, "Shall I crucify your king?" Chief priests answered and said, "We have no king but Caesar." Now that is convenient for them, political for them, but also revealing. Their entire religious system was a phony, was a fake. God, not even speaking about Jesus, God was not their king. Pilate was their king. They wanted to keep good relations with Pilate. They wanted to keep their position and their power. Remember when they first thought to kill Jesus? What did they say? The Romans will come take our position our place, and take our nation. Their position was more important than serving God. I alluded on Tuesday to foot washing, and I told, was everybody here on Tuesday on service? Told about the time Pastor Mary Beth and I got the left foot of fellowship. Let me just fill in a little details about that. It was a charismatic, an independent charismatic church. Elderly pastoral couple retiring. They asked us, Pastor Mary Beth and I, newly returned from Israel, to take a healing service on Saturday mornings as they were retiring. So we conducted a healing service every Saturday, at which time we saw cancer disappear, we saw blind eyes open, all those stories we tell you from that healing service. The pastors retired, and a new pastor came in. He was Pentecostal. I make a difference. This was charismatic. He was Pentecostal. Now, it's the same thing, basically, or should be, but I say it this way because he was high up in a Pentecostal denomination. The church was not part of that denomination. The church was an independent, charismatic church. He was high up in the denomination. His most important focus was that that church would pay a tithe to the denomination. Any church that's part of a denomination is not free to send their money to missions. They have to pay their tithe to the denomination. I don't know if anybody's ever been a part of a denomination, but that's the requirement. You pay your tithe to the denomination. So he was really intent on making sure that church paid tithes to his denomination. Secondly, he wanted to make sure that he lived in a big house. I'm being absolutely serious. There's an area outside of Washington, D.C. called Potomac, Maryland. And his goal was to live in Potomac. And those of you up in the D.C. area, he grew up in PG County. So just to let you know, he grew up in PG County. So to him, the height of his accomplishment would be to move from PG County to Potomac, Maryland. PG County is also in Maryland on the other side of the city. And he preached a basic message. He preached Jesus, but he didn't preach miracles. He didn't know miracles. That's not part of his denomination. He didn't say they passed away. He was baptized in the Holy Spirit, but he didn't move in the Spirit. So, he never attended one of our healing services, but he called us into his office, and he said, I want to know where you stand on three things. Faith, we failed. We believe in faith. Miracles, we failed. We believe in miracles. Healing the sick, laying hands on the sick, we failed because we boldly lay hands on the sick and saw miracles of healing. And from that point on, he worked at getting us out of the church. The Pharisees and he were not far apart. It's today. This is today. What a Pharisee is to me, anybody, no matter how they started out, born again, spirit-filled, but towed a denominational line. This is why, sometimes you think, Pastor Frank, you are so hard on denominations. This is why. I've seen it. I've seen what it does to people. It dumbs us down spiritually. People in denominations are spiritually dumb. They don't know about the things of God. They don't know about the moving of the Holy Spirit. They don't know about signs, wonders, and miracles. And in some denominations, they don't know about being born again. This is one of the reasons I'm so strong on this. And it doesn't mean that every church needs to be an independent church like us, but it means that every church needs to think independently and have a fresh experience with God each and every service, not what's dictated to them from above. And I mean from heaven, yes. Above the denomination, no. So the Pharisees, they just want to get rid of him. And I'm going to just skip ahead because I think I've taken up a lot of time already. A lot of people have a misconception of what happens at the last moments of Jesus' life. Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And the people standing there said, he's calling upon the Lord. Couldn't he that have opened the eyes of the blind come down from that cross? They mocked him and said, you who could rebuild the temple in 3 days, come down if you're a Messiah. Come down off that cross. Let's see you do something. People don't understand that my God, why have thou forsaken me, was a direct reference. Jesus was showing us, directing us to Psalm 22. Psalm 22, written 1,000 years before, when crucifixion was not in existence. They did not have capital punishment by crucifixion in the time of David, and yet David describes crucifixion in Psalm 22. The first verse of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Sounds familiar. Jesus wants us to look at this psalm. He says, goes through several, I'm not going to go through all the verses. I'm going to go down to verse 14. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. When someone was hung on the cross, usually their arms were tied and the nail would have gone through their wrists. Through their hands, it could have ripped off. Through the wrists, you could do the wrist bones, it would stay. Their feet were either through the ankles on either side of the cross or together and through their ankles. There was a little seat or a footrest. Very important. If they just hung them on the cross, nailed, they didn't die from loss of blood. They died from asphyxiation because your body would slump down. You can't stand straight if there's no footrest, if there's no rest to sit on. You would slump down, and in that position, you couldn't breathe. And very quickly, you would expire. So what it is as the body would slump down, you would push up with your feet that have nails in them to breathe. You'd push up. Every time you took a breath, you'd push up. Your bones would be out of joint from hanging. Not broken. Doesn't say our bones are broken. Out of joint. My heart is like wax. It melts in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue cleaves to my jaws. I thirst, he said. You brought me to the dust of death. Dogs have compassed me, surrounded me. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They've pierced my hands and my feet. None of my bones are broken. They look and stare at me. Crucifixion was always done just outside the main gate of the city so people could pass by and see. And by the way, bodies were not taken down from the crosses. They were left there to rot. So it was, number one, embarrassing for the person when they're being crucified because they were stripped naked. Number two, embarrassing for the family because their family members up there rotting. And number three, it was disgusting. And that was the idea of it. They wanted it to be disgusting, that it would be a detriment, that people would not, a deterrent, that people would not commit crime. Jesus' body was taken down because of the Passover. They part my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. Now, Jesus can't make them do that. David prophetically sees that 1,000 years before, and it takes place at the foot of the cross. So as we go through the day tomorrow, read through the Gospels. I like to take between 12 and 3, read through all 4 Gospels, the crucifixion, and think about what he did for us. Because if you or I were the only people alive, just one of us alive, he still would have done it just for us. He redeemed all of mankind by himself. And I believe that because of all these politics that were going on and religion that was going on, he redeemed us from them as well. He's redeemed us from sin, sickness and disease, politics, and religion. He did it all at the cross. So we thank God that whom the Son sets free is free indeed. In Jesus' name, amen.